The problem is you do see a lot of antisocial people succeed. Loneliness is as big a risk factor for ill health and death.
We live inside our heads.
You go cold turkey, you go into withdrawal.
There is a lot of value in the stuff that we struggle with.
Better Thinking. Conversations with experts exploring all things psychology. Welcome back to Better Thinking. My name's Nesh Nikolic, and today I have the privilege of speaking with Professor Zoltán Sarnyai, a neuroscientist and psychiatrist whose pioneering work sits at the forefront of metabolic psychiatry. Zoltán is a professor at James Cook University and has held positions at the University of Cambridge, Harvard Medical School, and the Rockefeller University. His groundbreaking research has explored the role of stress neuropeptides in addiction, the neurometabolic basis of schizophrenia, and the potential of ketogenic therapy in serious mental illness. He has been awarded the prestigious Richter Prize, served as Lady Davis Visitor Professor at the Technion Israel Institute of Technology, while also contributing to global efforts in nutritional psychiatry research. In our conversation, Zoltán and I discuss the history of metabolic psychiatry, the converging evidence leading to questions of how metabolic systems are related to mental health and physical health, and also his current randomized controlled trial on ketogenic metabolic therapy for serious mental illness. We explore the broader context of this emerging field, which may provide profound implications, positive implications for the future of psychiatric care. I really enjoyed speaking with Zoltán. It was an incredible privilege, and I'm excited to share our conversation with you, as I think there's so many takeaways and questions to be asked thereafter. Let's jump straight in. Zoltán, a big thank you for coming onto the show today. I have been looking forward to this conversation for a little while now, because this new space of metabolic psychiatry has really only come across my desk recently, and I really have admired your work, the lectures that you've provided, your contributions, and so I'm absolutely honoured and thrilled to have you on the program today to talk about this topic, which I think is really important when we think about healthcare. The psychological side in particular. There is a little bit of a neglect, I think, of the bio part of the biopsychosocial, and I'm excited to talk to you about this today.
Thank you very much, Nesh. Thanks very much for having me on. I'm very happy to be here and having this conversation with you.
Zoltán, can we start with maybe the silly question, which is, what is metabolic psychiatry? And maybe you can even take us on a little bit of a journey of how did this start?
This is not a silly question at all. This is actually a very fundamental question. I think this is what this emerging field is trying to define, almost as we speak. But what metabolic psychiatry or metabolic neuropsychiatry is trying to accomplish is to bring together the idea that energy metabolism in the brain is in close communication with the energy metabolism in the body. So the brain and the body are part of the same system. They have bi or even multi-directional communications with each other and between the different systems. Energy metabolism is an absolute fundamental aspect of not just human biology, but any biology for that matter. So whatever happens to the energy metabolism in the brain will have a widespread impact, not only on the functioning of the brain, but also on the functioning of the body, and almost vice versa. So I think the real power of metabolic psychiatry or metabolic neuropsychiatry will come from the fact that we appreciate that the brain works together with the body in order to assure optimal functioning through energy provision at the right time, at the right amount. This is actually quite important, and I've been going back and forth with metabolic psychiatry and metabolic neuropsychiatry, and that is again something important, because when we look at the brain, we have a diverse array of disorders of the brain. Some are structural. In other words, we can look at changes in a microscope. We can look at changes with structural brain imaging, and some are not like that. We may not see visible or microscopically visible changes in the brain, but there are still dramatic functional alterations resulting in altered cognition, altered emotional life, motivation, and all that. These days, these conditions roughly divide between neurology and psychiatry. And of course, this is mostly an artificial divide originating at the beginning of the 20th century, with different fields of medicine specializing and carving out their niche. But the very fundamental processes, such as energy metabolism, are such that they have applications. It has applications for both what we now call neurology and also what we now call psychiatry. So if we just think about classically neurological conditions, in other words, being looked after by neurologists, such as epilepsy or Parkinson's disease. Now we have actually an emerging understanding of these conditions as being underlined or at least very significantly contributed by altered energy metabolism in certain brain areas. And on the other side, conditions that are usually the domains of psychiatry, such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorders, major depression, they also have underlying neurometabolic features that actually are quite similar or even overlapping with findings from the domain of neurology. Like Alzheimer's disease, sometimes it's called type 3 diabetes because of the brain's inability to properly respond to insulin and therefore providing adequate energy for neurons to function, which may underlie, at least in part, the cognitive decline, the dramatic cognitive decline, and actual neural loss in the brain. Very similar features are being discovered in schizophrenia as well. Insulin resistance might be something that is an underlying feature for a number of psychiatric conditions. So that's what I'm saying, that metabolic psychiatry, metabolic neuropsychiatry deals with a very fundamental aspect of human life, energy metabolism, in a biologically, physiologically, scientifically driven manner. So what we say when we say energy, we are not referring to the sort of the new agey form of energy that is sort of around us, and I'm sending you good energies. It's not like that. This is an actual biology behind it. There are well-defined molecular pathways in the human body and in the human brain that assures that the energy sources, glucose, for example, and several others, are properly broken down. And at the end, the energy currency of the body, which is adenosine triphosphate or ATP, is being produced at the adequate amount, at the adequate time, and at the adequate place. That was my very long-winded answer to your short question.
No, it puts everything into such context, because we often don't think about neurology, our cognitions, our thinking on the basis of the fuel source, the energy metabolism that we provide, the brain to come up with the neurology. And so it's fascinating to hear how that's put together. We hear big, broad claims like, the mind-body connection, but we don't discuss it in the concept of there's a fuel source that we're trying to provide the brain. We often think about it that there's a deficiency that we're trying to put in a particular chemical, but we're not talking about the fuel, the fundamental, what runs the actual brain. And that's a bit of a shift, even though it sounds so logical. It feels like a bit of a shift if I were to speak about this with my colleagues. We're not discussing it in that way.
It's actually quite interesting what you're saying, because this is what we are seeing from the inside as well. Back in the 1980s, 1990s, really important major groundwork has been done at the fundamental neuroscience level, trying to understand how neurons make this molecule ATP. Are they doing it alone, or are they doing it together with some of the other cells in the brain, such as the astrocytes? When I went to medical school, we learned that astrocytes are there to support the neurons. So what does that actually mean? So providing energy substrates for neurons, that's one of the ways astrocytes support neurons. So actually, during the last 20, 25 years, a large and strong body of research has emerged about the fundamentals of energy metabolic processes in the brain. But that has been completely untouched by psychiatry until very recently. And I think that's why you are saying that, oh, we have not. Yes, we haven't either on the other side.
And what do you think has contributed to that? You spoke about the artificial divide that we separate the metabolic energy side to the neurological side. Why has that happened? Is that because we kind of just segment as human beings?
Yes, I think this is just the normal way how when human knowledge and seeking knowledge is becoming professionalized, then we all try to carve something out and define the borders and identify us in contrast to others. And this is very sort of normal human feature. All human groups do that. We are the inheritors of the early 20th, late 19th century European, mostly German back then, kind of systemizing thinking about medicine, since our understanding was very basic, very rudimentary at the time about the human brain. What our forebears could do, they could describe things, and they could put things into different drawers and put a label on them, because we had no understanding what's happening in the brain. And when someone like Alzheimer was actually able to demonstrate on microscopic slides dead neurons, so that was something. That was something to hang your stethoscope on, if you'd like. But on the other side, when a patient came and exhibited symptoms that were highly unusual, thinking that was very unusual, hearing voices which were threatening them, and there was nothing in the brain. So, for example, for a long time, schizophrenia was called the graveyard for neuropathologists, because they were looking at the brain of people died of schizophrenia, and they couldn't see much difference. Actually, there are quite a lot of difference as we have better technologies, and not only in post-mortem brain samples, but even in the human brain. But every scientific discipline has its own history, and this is how it's developed over time. And of course, professional societies emerged, and these two different areas divided completely. But there are tremendous overlaps, of course. Major neurological disorders like Parkinson's disease, for example, or Huntington's disease, which is a quite devastating neurodegenerative condition. They tend to start with what we now call psychiatric symptoms. Depression in the case of Parkinson's disease, and psychotic features in the case of Huntington's. So can we actually divide it to neurology and psychiatry? Yeah, depending on the expertise of the particular person who is dealing with them. But really, it's the brain and it's the functioning of the brain that produces this kind or that kind of symptoms.
There's been, I suppose, the metabolic psychiatry space has kind of given rise to also pattern recognition of metabolic conditions and how there is psychological components also correlating at the same time, has given rise to exploring this more so in the last period of time, and hence where this is now starting to take flight as a study.
What is really important in this space is that I think the question is probably not that why this division, 150 years ago developed between neurology and psychiatry, but why are we now trying to come closer? And that is really interesting in the form of metabolic psychiatry. I think that is really interesting because that has been driven by scientific evidence. It really has not been driven by some big theory. It was driven by emerging findings from decades of evidence gathering, scientific inquiry. So when you see that looking at transcriptomic changes, gene expression changes in the brain of people who died with the diagnosis of, let's say, schizophrenia, and you consistently find genes differentially expressed that are involved in different aspects of energy metabolism. When you keep seeing in human brain imaging studies, in the living human brain, that first of all, a long time ago, maybe more than 30 years ago now, it was discovered that the frontal part of the brain is not taking up as much glucose in brain imaging studies. And that was called hypofrontality. And that went along actually quite well with many of the symptoms of the schizophrenia that seems to be tied to which we now call the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And when you keep seeing in another set of brain imaging studies that a particular metabolite called lactate that comes from the rapid breakdown of glucose, lactate is increased, and this increased lactate level actually correlates with the cognitive functional impairments in these patients. So when from all the different directions, you are starting to see that something seems to be not quite right with fundamental brain energy metabolism. When you see that the tiny little machinery within the cell called mitochondrion, we have thousands of them in one neuron, mitochondria, that's the plural. They do many things, but from this point of view, they are the ones that produce the majority of ATP, this energy carrying molecule. And when you keep seeing in a number of different studies from a number of different labs around the world that mitochondrial function seems to be impaired in psychiatric disorders, almost across the board, when tend to see that even there are structural changes in these mitochondria, in post-mortem human brain samples, then everything seems to point to the fact that there seems to be an underlying fundamental energy metabolism abnormality. And I think that sort of understanding started to give rise to this emerging field from one direction. The other direction is, of course, is coming from seeing efficacy of novel treatment entities that are impacting on energy metabolism. And I'm just singling out one, the ketogenic metabolic therapy, which is usually called ketogenic diet as a shorthand. We know from 100 years of literature from the field of epilepsy, where this diet has been used over the last 100 years, and it's an evidence-based treatment for treatment-resistant epilepsy, that this therapeutic approach positively impacts on energy metabolism. It has effects on mitochondrial health, mitochondrial ATP production. And when we use this treatment approach in psychiatry, in schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder, patients tend to respond actually quite well. Very early days, not yet major randomized controlled clinical trials, but again, this sort of points to the direction that there might be energy metabolism abnormalities. If you think about the history of psychiatry back in the 1950s, when the first antipsychotic drugs were discovered by complete serendipity, and then 10, 15 years later, neuropharmacology reached the point that we understood that they actually bind to the receptors of the neurotransmitter dopamine in the brain. Then that gave rise to this whole idea that too much or too little of certain neurotransmitters in the brain may underlie different forms of psychiatric disorders. I think now we are going through a similar, which was at the time revolutionary thinking and completely different from what we had before that. Now focusing on a much more fundamental aspect of brain function, which is brain energy metabolism. But as I said at the beginning, it has been driven by the accumulating scientific evidence.
There's been a converging observations in scientific inquiry that have led to showing a connection between the fuel source and the metabolic expressions, being everything from physical, neurological, psychological experiences. And some of those have come from a long time ago. You've said 100 years ago or thereabouts, with treating epilepsy or treating seizures relating to epilepsy using fuel source management, ketogenic diet. Can you maybe talk me through that as maybe a starting point, and then what other connections we've found? It's inferring that the lower carbohydrate diet, at least in that condition, has a positive effect.
I think the fact that glucose metabolism is somehow linked to major psychiatric disorders, that idea has been around for actually quite a long time. It's usually good to look back, and in order to understand the present, we need to understand the history. And I actually love to go back in medical or history of science areas to look at how these ideas developed. And yes, you can put a very nice story together at the end, and it looks like a series of logical steps, one following the other. But even if we go back to the 19th century, the famous British psychiatrist Henry Maudsley already described in in his book that in families where, and he called it insanity at the time, and that roughly translates to our diagnosis, schizophrenia now. So he described that in these families, diabetes seems to prevail. So there's a higher incidence of diabetes in those families, and it's not just the affected individual, but family members as well. Really interesting. Not much happened with that thought. And if we fast forward to the 1940s, that was the time when insulin shock therapy was in vogue in psychiatry. So what they basically did back then, not having any understanding of what really is happening in the brain, they administered insulin, and that brought down blood glucose level, induced a condition called hypoglycemia. And this hypoglycemic shock seems to have some effect on the brain, which was beneficial at the patient. But that's putting that aside. While they were doing that, they discovered that people with schizophrenia required much higher doses of insulin to push them down to the hypoglycemia, which indicates what we now call insulin resistance. And when they administered something which is done diagnostically these days for type 2 diabetes called the glucose tolerance test, they administered sugary solution for people. They found a pattern in people with schizophrenia which was identical to the pattern of people with type 2 diabetes. So, and this is all before the introduction of antipsychotic drugs. So we couldn't just turn around and say, oh yeah, we know that antipsychotics have negative effects and side effects on metabolism, and it could be because of that. No, it wasn't. It was something that is inherently linked to the disease process. But then it was not followed up further until much, 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 much later.
But even back then, there was a inkling, there was a connection that could be observed that they were trying to tap into about seeing diabetes rates, insulin rates among those who, air quotes, were showing signs of insanity, which most likely is some sort of psychosis, schizophrenia, etc.
It's a severe mental
and some of the treatment was administering insulin, which obviously affects the glucose metabolic space, and they found some treatment value in that. It just wasn't necessarily followed up or continued with the same level of scientific rigor that maybe today is occurring.
I think the field just moved on. By the early 1950s, the first antipsychotics and then antidepressants appeared, and these previous approaches like electroconvulsive therapy, insulin shock, cold water, all sorts of different things desperate psychiatrists try to do, they completely disappeared, and a new era emerged around the 1950s, driven by the new psychopharmacology developing at the time.
How far has this developed? What is it that we do know in terms of how effective is this connection, or how stable is this connection between, let's say, glucose metabolism and psychological well-being, mental health? What do we know currently?
We know that glucose is the primary substrate for the production of ATP in the brain. Not the only one, and we can get to that point later on, but it's the one that cells, including neurons, nerve cells, and astrocytes, and all the other cells, can use more easily and most easily and most quickly. We know that without adequate supply of glucose, there is a suboptimal production of ATP. And if we do not have this ATP, our brain cannot function properly. Numbers are actually quite telling. A single neuron produces 4 billion ATP molecules a second. It's a staggering number. That's the whole population of the continent of Asia. It's a staggering number. And ATP is essential for life. So when neurons communicate with one another, they generate electrical impulses. And the electrical impulses are generated by positive and negative ions moving through the membrane. And these electrical impulses are called action potentials. And those are underlined by the movement of sodium, potassium, and chloride. At the end of this activation, at the end of the action potential, everything needs to be turned back to the baseline. Because if that does not happen, there is no next action potential, and everything stops. So that returning to the baseline thing is fueled by ATP. So all these ions need to go back to their original place. Sodium needs to leave the cell along with some potassium and all that. And that cannot happen without ATP being present. These are so-called active transport mechanisms. They require this energy-carrying molecule ATP. And this is happening every single millisecond in the hundreds of millions of neurons in our brain. When our brain or certain areas of our brain is more active, then more ATP is required. And then ATP is required for neurons to communicate with one another. When a neuron emits a chemical called neurotransmitter, that again is a process that is driven by and supported by ATP. If ATP is not there, these chemicals, dopamine, serotonin, they cannot be released properly or cannot be recycled properly to the neuron. So insufficient ATP supply due to insufficient breakdown of glucose or insufficient provision of glucose to the neurons will result in a suboptimal functioning of neuron at best, and at worst, it could destroy the neuron.
Zoltán, you said, and I hope I'm getting this right, glucose is the most accessible substrate to create ATP. And similarly, you said ATP is used for basically the action potential, returning the action potential back to baseline so it can occur again.
Among many other things.
Many other things. Yeah. There's an insufficient ATP production is connected with problems. How is it that glucose is the most accessible substrate while insufficient ATP production can be happening?
Because glucose is either not present in a sufficient amount, and let's just think about hypoglycemia. It's a condition when blood glucose level drops. So people with type 1 diabetes, their glucose homeostasis needs to be controlled by the self-injected insulin, because that's what the condition is, the lack of insulin. And what insulin does, insulin helps to push glucose into the cell. Doesn't matter how much glucose we eat, if that glucose does not get into the cell, cells would be swimming in glucose but starving to death. So that's why we require glucose in our body for that. So people with type 1 diabetes, when, for example, they don't have their breakfast on time, their blood glucose drops, and they very easily become unable to concentrate, become confused, and they can slip into what's called a hypoglycemic coma, potentially life-threatening. And this is all because of lack of glucose to the brain. Because many other parts of our body can deal with limited amount of glucose over a long period of time. Because many other tissues, like our muscles, have stored form of glucose called glycogen. Neurons cannot really store glycogen, just almost a negligible amount. The neighboring cells, which we call astrocytes, they are able to store glucose in the form of glycogen, and they break that down to glucose and help the neuron, but that is not sufficient, and it makes the brain extremely vulnerable for these metabolic conditions when either the supply or the processing of glucose to ATP is insufficient. Our muscles are happy. Our liver is happy. Liver is a huge big store of glycogen. Muscles, another big store of glycogen. So they can go without glucose for quite some time, and they keep breaking down the stored form. The brain does not have that luxury.
How does that relate to the modern diet, where many of us are having high amounts of carbohydrates, in the forms of pastas and pastries and breads, obviously plenty of sugars, high energy drinks and the like, where there's a high perceived carbohydrate. Well, there is high carbohydrates. Do they get turned into glucose? And they can then be used for the ATP production.
Yes. And you would say, oh, that's great.
That sounds good.
Eat more carbohydrates, and then our brain gets more ATP. The situation is slightly more complicated than that. So I'm not a dietitian, neither a sort of a diet expert. So but I'll try to answer your question here. If you look at human evolutionary history, until the agricultural revolution, the carbohydrate intake must have been quite limited. So hunter-gatherer lifestyle. You kill animals, you eat them, it will give you fat and protein, a whole lot. Relatively little carb. Gathering. You gather berries, you gather bits and pieces of plants, which you eat. They are source of carbohydrate to some degree, but we have to keep in mind all the ancestors of our fruit we now buy in the supermarket, they were not tasty. They were not, fantastically sweet peach or sweet grape. That's all the product of hundreds and thousands of years of human agriculture. So yes, they must have contained a lot of carbohydrate, but those carbohydrates were relatively complex carbohydrates, not refined sugar. Refined sugar, which we found in soft drinks, sweetened soft drinks, of course, also the source of desserts and some forms of pasta and some forms of bread, are the ones that result in a very rapid increase in blood glucose level. And we mentioned insulin already. So when glucose goes up in the bloodstream, because we eat carbohydrate-containing food, or we drink a huge, big 2-liter of Coke, just full of sugar, full of refined sugar, it gets into the bloodstream immediately. Blood glucose goes up, and the thing that the body does, it produces insulin. and releases insulin from the pancreas for that glucose to disappear and go into the cell. So this is normal physiology. And the body is happy to do that. But if you keep repeating it, 20 times a day, every single day for 20 years, what happens is the body becomes resistant to insulin. So all those proteins that bind the insulin on the cell, they become unresponsive or non-responsive to insulin. And this insulin resistance seems to be quite an important underlying feature of a number of chronic systemic and brain disorders as well, usually associated with something which is called low-grade inflammation. So inflammatory chemicals linger around in the body and do their deleterious things here and there over a long period of time, contributing to the negative health effect. So the optimal nutrition, if there is such thing, probably it's quite individualized depending on people's lifestyle and all that, should have some carbohydrate in there, but should not be driven by carbohydrate. So what happens if you have too much of this glucose? So the body has to do something with it, and it's converted into fat. And that's why we grow fat and gain weight and have all the negative cardiovascular, cardiometabolic consequences. And we are just at the beginning to understand what happens in our brain in a situation like that. A colleague of mine in Australia has been doing some really, really interesting experiments, providing high carbohydrate, high fat, sort of Western diet to rats. And even just 1 week on that diet impairs cognitive function. So these rats are clever animals. They can learn many different things in experimental settings, and their memory, their learning abilities, all detrimental effect.
Wow.
And we can control that in an experimental setting. So it is caused by that sort of diet.
So glucose obviously is very important, or the glycogen. It's the volume and frequency that then begins to affect the body over time, because the insulin response becomes less and less effective. And as that becomes less effective, we start seeing impairment. In this example that you provided, that might impair cognitive function, memory, learning. Has that also been shown in humans?
Of course, in humans, the research you can do is quite different. Ethically, you cannot put someone on a dietary regime or you strongly suspect going to be detrimental. What human research does, collects data and try to link certain dietary patterns with certain changes in brain function. And these associational studies. So you cannot quite say that it is caused by the dietary pattern, but you can say that a certain dietary pattern is associated with, comes together, may be caused by, but we do not really have the causative evidence because of obvious ethical constraints, result in some sort of functional or even structural abnormality in the human brain. And those data are definitely around. And it's
the correlation must be high enough that the ketogenic diet use for epilepsy has been provided. I'm not sure whether that's a current approach that medicine observes as being efficacious, but there must be something in there to say if we reduce the rate of refined carbohydrates, that we get a improved response, meaning fewer seizures and the like. But obviously ethics can't allow for us to say there's enough evidence to say that there's harm by providing high carbohydrates, but we're going to do it anyway. You're not allowed to do that anymore.
Yes, but the reverse can be done, as you suggested,
Yes.
and those studies have been and being conducted, and we have an emerging, body of evidence to show that low carbohydrate diet or low carbohydrate, high fat diet, which is the ketogenic diet, provide beneficial effects on brain function. A lot of case studies, a number of small clinical trials definitely support that. Definitely support that.
And I assume as well, by just regular diabetes studies, if low carbohydrates are introduced, or not, like, my apologies, if carbohydrate levels are reduced through diet, the insulin resistance goes down as well. That over time it improves, and this is why diet is often used.
Yes.
Treatment of type 2 diabetes.
Yes, absolutely. And it is becoming more and more part of the mainstay of managing type 2 diabetes. JAMA, the leading medical journal, publishes papers showing the efficacy of either low carb or ketogenic diet in the management of type 2 diabetes with good efficacy. We see improved glucose insulin profile in our own randomized controlled clinical trial with ketogenic diet. Other colleagues who are doing or have done studies like that, they see exactly the same thing. So if you limit carbohydrate intake, of course, every single time carbohydrate metabolized into glucose rises in the blood, insulin will come out. If you limit that this continuous bombardment of cells with shots of insulin over time will decrease. And the phenomenon we talked about, insulin resistance, will decrease as well. So insulin sensitivity, that's the other side of the coin. Insulin sensitivity will increase in these individuals, which is associated with a better metabolic health. That's been known for quite a long time. And it seems also associated with a better mental health and brain functioning as well.
I just want to go back to the term energy sources, because once we start introducing the word diet, all this can be forgotten, right? Or it switches something in the brain. We're really saying here that low carbohydrates, lowering carbohydrate intake. I've also heard about lowering inflammation foods as well. Are a encouraged energy source for the body and the brain to function at its best. I'm a little bit stuck here, however, Zoltán, if you can help me out. ATP production requires glucose, while here we're saying let's reduce the carbohydrate level. Can you explain that mechanism, why we're aiming there? Because they sound a little bit contradictory in this one sentence, and I'm hoping you can clear this up for me.
So I think to begin with, our contemporary diet probably contains excess carbohydrate intake. A lot more than would be required to maintain adequate energy supply for the human body and the brain. So that's one thing.
Excess meaning how much? Because that I think sounds interesting, and I say that because I know in a ketogenic diet, the numbers are tiny considering what our current food sources are.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly. And some people do intermittent fasting, eating just once a day, which means that a good 22 hours go without taking a gram of sugar, a gram of glucose. But you see, I said glucose is the primary source of ATP, but the body is clever. The body can turn everything into a molecule that goes into the glucose metabolism pathway. So we eat three kinds of food: carbohydrate, fat, and protein. The body cannot make ATP directly from proteins or from fat, but the body can metabolize proteins into amino acids, which then turned into the same biochemical cycle that is downstream of glucose metabolism. So it's channeled into the same process. And the same thing is true for fat. So fats are broken down to a molecule called acetyl coenzyme A, which then enters into the same biochemical process that underlies ATP production. So in the end, all of our food sources will support ATP production, but they support it in a roundabout way. First, they need to be metabolized through actually quite complex biochemistry into molecules that can then enter into the biochemical cycle that further down the line produces ATP. Is that a bit more clear?
Yes, I'm trying to I'm beginning to understand it. The fat and the protein component is probably the higher component alongside carbohydrates. There's still an aspect of the carbohydrates, but it's a lot less required to then create ATP. Or not. I haven't quite understood that. Or is it that we've got so many reserves in us that we can just produce?
Not really. Think about the Inuits. They kill the seal and they eat the seal. Most of them is fat.
Yes.
Traditionally, I don't know about today, but traditionally,
yeah, their food source would be predominantly
they had
fat and protein.
Very limited access to carbohydrates.
Yes.
Very limited access, especially refined carbohydrates. You can maintain the body on fat, on protein. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but it's physiologically viable because the body has ways to break down fat, to break down proteins into molecules that can be fed into the same biochemical pathway that produces ATP in the end.
That makes sense. The carbohydrate problem is the insulin problem that then creates the resistance based on today's modern diet.
And of course, if there is insulin resistance, blood glucose steadily keeps rising because it's not being pushed into the cells because the cells are not able to react properly to insulin. So this elevated blood glucose, glucose molecules alter proteins on the surface of the cell called glycation, and it's not a good thing. It actually contributes in the development of this low-grade inflammation that's happening all over the body and very likely in the brain as well.
So we're talking about trying to find an optimal energy source for the body that then has its mechanism to convert those energy sources into glucose, glycogen that the brain then uses. It's not necessarily the food directly feeds the brain.
Yeah.
The food that we eat feeds the body, and there's a metabolic process there that then produces the best source for the brain. And yes, it's all one system, and so we often talk about it as that the food feeds the brain, but the food is feeding the metabolic process that then says this is the optimal that we're trying to give to the brain. And so obviously the optimal food for the body is not high refined sugars.
Not really, not really.
It creates problems.
But if you think about what happens in the human body during fasting, when we think about basic fundamental biology and physiology, we always have to keep in mind how these systems must have developed through the millions of years of evolution. So our species, for most of our history, probably until the agricultural revolution, probably spent a good chunk of their day fasting or not eating. And then successful hunt, they ate a lot. And it took another how many days until they had another successful hunt. And in between, gathering fruits, gathering plants, and eating them probably sustained them. But if we just look at fasting, so if I'm fasting, not eating for 24 hours, so how can I still fuel my brain? I'm not taking any glucose, and I think this is where your question is coming from. I'm not taking any glucose. Yes, but that's okay. I'm not taking any glucose because I have stores of glucose in my body, and that's glycogen. So when I'm fasting, liver breaks down glycogen into glucose. And that elevates blood glucose. Glucose pushed into the cell. And then glycogen breakdown also occurs in the muscles, and glucose goes up. And those stores would probably carry me for a few days. Not forever, not forever. And then the next one is fat, which can be quickly or relatively quickly metabolized by the body. So fat stores are starting to be used to produce this molecule acetyl coenzyme A that can enter into the ATP producing pathway. So we start losing weight.
Yes.
If we fast or if we starve. So when it becomes starvation, first goes glycogen, then goes fat, and third goes protein. And we start losing muscle, actual muscle mass through starvation. And if it goes on, we might die in the end. But the body is very well equipped to deal with temporary shortage of food.
Which makes a lot of evolutionary sense.
Yes.
We didn't have historically an abundance of food. We did not have a supermarket. And so
most certainly we did
long periods of time where we might not eat. And long periods might be a fasting period, might be much longer. But you would use up your glycogen stores first, and then you would tap into your fat stores. And obviously fat can still go and produce the ATP and the like. But there's a modulating system. And if you expend both glycogen and fat, at that point, probably becomes much more serious, which is you start eating into your own protein.
So this is one more important point here. And you started out talking about the different sources of ATP. And I said, yes, it's glucose is the main. But physiologically, when we fast and our body starts breaking down fat, that's when ketone bodies are produced. So these are the ketones. They have long names like beta-hydroxybutyrate, acetoacetate, and acetone. So these three are the main ketone bodies produced by the liver from the metabolism of fat. So ketone bodies, along with glucose, can be direct source of ATP. Ketone bodies travel all over the body, get into the cell. They have special transporters, get them into the cell, get them through the blood-brain barrier. They get into neurons, they get into astrocytes, and they can be metabolized to make ATP. Actually, beta-hydroxybutyrate, or BHB, the main ketone body, is a richer source of ATP than glucose. So the same amount, molar amount of beta-hydroxybutyrate makes more ATP molecule than the same amount of glucose. And that's what our body does during starvation, or even during fasting, but definitely during starvation, until we have the fat stores. And this is what we are mimicking with the ketogenic diet. So that's how ketogenic diet clinically started. So people discovered that fasting improves seizures. Even if you go back to the Bible, there are stories fasting and reduction of seizure. So early 20th century neurologists observed that fasting has beneficial effect on seizure. The problem is you cannot fast someone forever. And that's how ketogenic diet was introduced, because it's a fasting mimicking diet. Metabolically, it mimics what happens during fasting. Very little glucose, very little carb, quite a lot of fat, some protein in between, and that quite a lot of fat is then transformed by the liver to ketone bodies, which then become the source of ATP instead of glucose.
Mm. And clearly the fasting is directly affecting the insulin response. It's then tapping into when the glycogen stores have been depleted, it taps into the fat, breaking down the fat, which creates ketone bodies, and they can be used for the production of ATP as well with some of glycogen, but that's taken from the stored glycogen in the fat, I suppose, as well. Those two things come together. Wow.
So if you think about fasting, every major religion have fasting of some sort.
Yes.
In its religious practice. And these have been around for a couple of thousand years or longer, and could be interpreted as a divine message, but it could be interpreted as human experience. People figured out that fasting has some benefits.
I mean, I self-disclosure, since coming onto this path, finding out about metabolic psychiatry, I am trying to moderate my fuel sources. And I have found I've found quite a number of improvements. I haven't experienced this clearness of cognition and focus and thought and the like. Having said that, I sleep much better. I'm not drowsy throughout the day at all. I used to be incredibly, drowsy. I haven't had a headache since I've moderated my fuel source, and my energy levels are as high as they ever be. Yesterday, as an example, I didn't eat from the night before, and I didn't eat throughout the day, and I finished work and I ran 30 plus kilometers. I had one apple during the run, and that's all I ate yesterday. Now, that's not a normal day, but it didn't affect my energy sources. It wasn't like I was like, oh, I need to eat something for energy. You can just run, right? It's very slow running. But it says to me, my body has capacity to continue to produce energy, and I could choose not to eat today as well. Yes, I'm going to lose a lot of weight if I did that, and I'm not suggesting that's good, but it's evidence. It's observational evidence to say I've got plenty of energy. I can continue to function. Will I feel hunger at some point? Of course I will. But I don't feel hunger like I've...
Not as much.
Hunger's not in this equation. It used to be. Hunger was there. I mean, I didn't have high hunger levels previously, but I have very little. I still like to eat, absolutely, but it has gone down 80%. 80%. I'm struggling with cravings and I've been doing this for quite a number of weeks now. And I just don't have that struggle, which I historically always have. And that is a cognitive shift where I've got a lot of willpower, and so I can fight things. I'm like, I don't have to use willpower. And I've got someone who's got plenty, so I'm like, wow, this changes the psychological game. If I apply this to clients, if they don't have to use willpower, that changes things, because willpower can be absolutely soul destroying. It just takes so much of your energy, and not to have that around is it's an N equals 1. But it says something.
Yes, yes. I think this is very well put, Nash. You summarized it really well, and I don't want to get into the sort of the physical and the metabolic benefit, but you started out saying that you haven't really experienced an improvement in cognition. Yes, because your brain function was optimal before that. So it's really hard to improve what's already working at an optimum level. Cognition, by the way, is something that is, notoriously difficult to improve by sort of pharmacological interventions or any other interventions. Because if we are not suffering from some sort of cognitive problem, then our brain probably works at an optimum level. You can tweak here, you can increase attention, you can increase concentration, you can increase overall alertness and arousal, but memory, learning, things like that, that's notoriously difficult to improve. And that's why I actually like calling ketogenic diet a ketogenic metabolic therapy. I think it's different from a lifestyle ketogenic diet, which is probably something close to what you are practicing. A ketogenic metabolic therapy is a medical intervention with a particular medical indication, with appropriate contraindications as well, and with probably side effects, with efficacy, but also not for everybody. There is no medication that works for everyone. And we need to consider proper ketogenic diet used for medical purposes as ketogenic metabolic therapy. Unless I measure ketone levels in the blood, at least on a daily basis, and I can demonstrate that my blood ketone levels are above 0.5 millimole per liter, then it's not a ketogenic diet. It doesn't matter what I think I eat or I don't eat, as long as my body is not in the metabolic ketotic state, it doesn't matter. So it has to be kept within a certain range. We don't actually know yet what that certain range exactly is, and may not be a universal certain range for everybody. And this is a very, very new field, and we are just at the beginning to understand the clinical impact and also the individual aspect to it. You and I are different. Every single individual have their own metabolism, have their own things in life. We don't know what's the impact of, let's say, the menstrual cycle on getting into ketosis. We don't know if there are profound sex differences. We don't know that yet. But we do know that if we want to use this dietary metabolic approach for modifying courses of mental health disorder conditions, then we have to consider it as a ketogenic metabolic therapy, which is slightly different from a lifestyle use of ketogenic diet.
Yeah. And is that also what you mean in terms of the research that you discussed about your colleague that introduced high carbohydrates to rats and seeing impairment functioning? Obviously, the reversal of that is effectively finding individuals that you can relatively reliably appreciate their high, or I suppose there's markers like insulin resistance would demonstrate the markers of high refined sugars, and then reversing that is both ethically allowed, and then studies can be done in that fashion to see mental health outcomes, physical outcomes, and the like. Can you talk about research that has done that, or where are we at with that from a mental health perspective?
Yeah, so let me give you an example outside of the mental health field, because that actually addresses the issue we are talking about, and then I'll move on to the mental health. Last year there was a beautiful paper published in Science, one of the leading scientific journals, in which they took advantage of the fact that after the Second World War, there was sugar rationing in the United Kingdom. So limited amount of sugar was allowed to be consumed because it was shortage. It was tremendous shortage after the war. So the government limited the amount of sugar each families could buy. And there was a beginning of that, and there was an official end of that. So there is a period of X number of years where we actually know by gram how much sugar was consumed during that period of time by people in the United Kingdom. And we also know how that sugar consumption changed after the rationing was lifted. And we know that it increased 4 times. So what this clever study did, they actually asked the question, was there any effect of the sugar rationing on the later development of certain medical conditions? And they were able to show really beautifully that kids who were born and were very young during the time of sugar rationing had a significantly better outcome for their cardiovascular and cardiometabolic disorders than the ones that were born after the rationing was lifted, and they were exposed to 4 times higher amount of sugar intake. In that population, 20, 30, 40 years after that, and we are talking about, so this was late 40s, early 50s, 1940s, 1950s. So by the late 1990s, early 2000s, those people were in their 50s or 60s. So cardiovascular disorders had their chance to develop. And that's exactly what they saw, that when they were exposed early in life with higher sugar consumption, the likelihood of developing cardiovascular disorders increased very significantly. And we are talking about large numbers here, large numbers, statistically very strong study. And it's beautifully limited by exact dates. So I think as far as sort of systemic disorders are concerned, that's a very, very strong link that consuming too much sugar is not necessarily good for you. Interestingly, the sugar consumption during the sugar rationing in the UK was around the amount that is the recommended dietary amount of sugar consumption. So, people are aware, even, public health professionals are aware of the fact that refined sugar consumption needs to be limited because it has deleterious effect on health, including brain health.
And this is those scenarios where skeptics would say these are correlations rather than causation, which is accurate. At the same time, we're talking about a converging observations,
This was actually
scientific inquiry,
the experiment of nature, if you'd like. It's not necessarily an association, just.
Yeah, because the controls were very.
It was an intervention.
Yes,
it was an intervention.
Yes, very powerful stuff. Wow, wow, and that's just looking at the physical metabolic.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Physical metabolic conditions, not sort of going into the psychological per se. Wow, I'm a bit taken aback by that. It is going out and seeing so many perspectives observations pointing in the same direction, and these aren't just theoretical. These are scientifically based, where we're trying to go out and just say, what's the data pointing towards?
Yes, this is
and this isn't even controversial. Like reducing refined sugar is not controversial. I don't believe so.
It should not be.
No. And in terms of the studies that are available around the psychological side, that reversing, reducing the high carbohydrate levels, is there research in that space, case studies, any population-based work?
I think one of the best examples or best answer to your question might come from looking at published evidence on ketogenic diet or ketogenic metabolic therapy, because that is limited carbohydrate and a higher percentage of fat in that diet. Ketogenic metabolic therapy has been tried with demonstrated and published success in a variety of conditions affecting the brain. And I just wanted to avoid neurological versus psychiatric conditions affecting the brain, from epilepsy to schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. And I can talk about that as well later on, but I would just probably mention one paper published, I think last year, by my ex-PhD student, who is now at the UK university lecturer there. She did something very clever. I think that was around the time of COVID, when she started out her career in her new academic job, and you couldn't really do anything which would involve people getting together and talking to each other. So she initiated an online survey, surveyed people who use ketogenic diet for one reason or another, like yourself and many other people. So she surveyed a large number of people and asked them a lot of questions about their dietary habits, was able to put together what they were eating, and she also administered online a number of different questionnaires. And it was actually quite clear that people who were on low-carb ketogenic diet, they had much better scores in their perceived stress, in their anxiety, and in their depression. And they were likely to be healthy from the point of view of sort of mental health conditions. But they did note improvements enough to be shown by these different psychological rating scales. So I think that is interesting. That is interesting. From the sort of more clinically oriented research, in the domain of bipolar disorders and schizophrenia, over the last almost 10 years now, the first modern case study published about ketogenic diet in schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, was published 2017. And since then, actually quite a large number of case studies or case series where people with certain psychiatric conditions, schizophrenia, schizoaffective, bipolar, They were put on ketogenic diet or ketogenic metabolic therapy, and they improved. Some are very well documented, showing improvements in psychiatric rating scales. Others contain more of a sort of subjective report of the improvement of these individuals. But I think probably very importantly, last year, there were two papers, one published by a group at Stanford and the other one at University of Edinburgh. Neither are randomized controlled clinical trials. So they were sort of an open arm group of individuals asked to be on ketogenic metabolic therapy. And they knew what they were on, and there was no control group as such. But even under these conditions, and each of these studies, these two studies had about 20-something individuals, so not large, pilot studies. You have to start somewhere. Clear improvement in response to ketogenic diet in psychosis-related symptoms, overall mental health, well-being, and improvement in their metabolic functioning as well. So it's very promising. But as I started out, this whole thing needs to be driven by hard scientific evidence, especially when we get into this issue of diet and nutrition. There is so much out there. And one says one thing, the other thing says completely the opposite. And we all want to control our weight. We all want to live to 200 years, and we try to watch what we eat, but we don't really know what to eat. So this is why I think it's really important to stick to science and stick to scientific evidence. And the gold standard of that is the randomized controlled clinical trial. When we enroll individuals with a particular diagnosis, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, randomly assign them into either a control arm or the ketogenic metabolic therapy arm, and they are tested in a blinded fashion. In other words, the trial personnel who test their psychological, mental health, psychiatric functioning are unaware of their particular diet allocation. So this is very, very important. And there are a number of studies like that ongoing with ketogenic metabolic therapy at the moment. My lab is carrying out, actually close to finishing up, a trial like that. And we have been learning quite a lot by doing this trial. Among other things, we are learning that the importance of having a proper control arm. Because people usually are eating something that is far from optimal healthy diet. You move them into a different diet, being that, let's say, ketogenic diet. Yes, there will be changes. And it's not easy to modify diet from a certain form to a completely different form. So if we do not have a proper control to that, we will never be able to figure out what's due to the diet and what's due to talking to them a lot. So in our own trial, our participants are either on ketogenic diet or on the diet guided by the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, which is very different from what they eat on a daily basis. And they require just as much guidance, just as much support as the other group. They have the same amount of interaction with the dietitian, with the trial personnel as the ketogenic diet group. They also have to measure their glucose and ketones every day, and they have to report that to the trial personnel. Both groups do that. And if they both improve and one improves more than the other, that differential improvement can be attributed to the diet and not the extra diet factors. Or finally, there is someone to talk to. We have a lovely trial personnel, lovely dietitian, great trial manager. Interacting with them is beneficial. to their psychological functioning. Yes, that's definitely true.
Mm.
And everybody improves in a clinical trial because they are being looked after, being listened to, being talked to. But the question is how much they improve and whether that improvement can be attributed to the intervention.
Mm-hmm. And the importance of the fact that both groups are making a significant change to their diets.
Yeah.
It controls for that. It's wrong to say placebo effect, but in terms of the change effect and saying I'm doing something different, therefore I will feel better. You know, I'm going with Australian standards, which mentally says that's a healthy standard. So both of them have that aspect to a good degree. But the control of that humanistic part in terms of support, so that can be said, well, you know, that equals that out. And also lots of strong measures. So we can go out and say we're actually measuring what needs to be measured.
So we are measuring different aspects of mental health functioning using established psychiatric rating scales. We take blood samples at the beginning, in the middle, at the end of the 12-week trial to establish metabolic changes systemically all over the body. Of course, we have their daily reports of glucose and ketone blood levels. That's very important because, as I said, unless the ketone level is above a certain limit, it's not ketosis. And that's where our dietitian comes in and has a very individualized approach starting out. So what do you like to eat? So you like to eat this. So let's see how this kind of eating pattern can best be turned into either a diet that meets the criteria of the Austrian Guide to Healthy Eating or to a ketogenic diet. So it's actually quite individualized, as you can imagine. And we collect a lot of other information as well. So cognitive functions are notoriously difficult to improve using antipsychotic drugs in schizophrenia in particular. The antipsychotics that are used in clinical practice are effective in some patients, controlling hallucinations, delusions, but not the cognitive aspect, which could be the most bothersome bit for the individual. These antipsychotics don't do much. So we are really interested to see whether the ketogenic metabolic therapy has a beneficial effect. So we have a very broad cognitive testing at the beginning, at the end. It's a non-verbal touchscreen-based test system, test battery that's been established in Cambridge, University of Cambridge 20 years ago, and has been very extensively used for research and also some clinical applications as well. We also collect fecal samples at the beginning and at the end. So it's a diet, it's a dietary intervention, and the diet interacts with your body first through the gut microbiome. We have these trillions of bacteria living in our gastrointestinal system, in our guts. And these are the first one that see the diet. And they do change. We know that. And we also know that the gut microbiome has tremendous influence in our overall physiology and our brain functioning as well. So we are extremely interested in seeing whether some of the effects might be mediated by the gut microbiome. It's really, really interesting. We also asked them to wear a couple of wearable devices. They wear the Oura Ring, and they wear a smartwatch-like device, a medical-grade smartwatch, which measures heart rate variability, skin temperature. So indices of the autonomic nervous system's stress activity for 1 week at the beginning and 1 week at the end of the trial, continuously, 7 days, 24 hours, 7 days. Yeah, so quite a lot of information we are collecting from them, and we are trying to understand how the dietary metabolic intervention can be beneficial, and through what kind of mechanisms. Because I think in order for this new approach to find its way into clinical practice, we need to have some level of mechanistic understanding. It's not just sufficient to say, oh, this works, but how does it actually do that?
This is why I was so excited to speak with you, Zoltán, is your approach to observation is not one that is just theoretical based, but a genuine exploration of what are the known facts, where's the science pointing, how strong is the science, what's a signal versus what is, much stronger effect size. What you've just described in terms of your research not only jumps out at me as being incredibly costly. So thank you to the grant system, whoever's funding this, because we need this type of research. But
we are very
well
fortunate
structured.
to have philanthropic support for the clinical trial.
The incredible structure in which you're describing this is built, so that the results that come out can stand up to scrutiny. They can actually say, yes, these are some of the shortcomings, but we've controlled for as many elements as we can, hence why the cost is always incredible. I love the fact that even the fecal sample is taken. I recently had Professor Gordon Parker on the podcast as well, talking about the research that he's been looking into, and these worlds are converging. And this is what excites me so much, as I'm not an academic, I'm only a clinician. But I feel like I'm a bit of a scientist at heart, or at least I like to think through that lens. And collecting this data is incredibly important, because I don't think there is that silver bullet, as you say, of it's going to be a keto diet. It's like, this is clumsy way of human language. It's obviously going to be informed by science. We all need to find what our biology works with. There's a complexity with gut microbiomes and our own, individual, DNA and what we've been exposed to in our lives, early life, like lifehood, sometimes ancestry. We've got some interesting stuff in that. It's complex, and having an open mind rather than saying, hey, it's really lovely to advertise, I've got the cure, is just not scientific. But science says, I've got signals, and there are lots of signals, and let's try and understand the pattern recognition within those, that then I can apply to an N equals 1. Because ultimately, therapy still has to be, focused in on the N equals 1. And what you've described is beautiful. And I really look forward to finding out how this trial goes, and obviously the write-up of the paper. I'm more than happy to get an early copy if you want to send any out. That's incredible. That's incredible.
Yes, we are really, really excited to see the outcome. Would be very early to say anything at this stage.
How many weeks before it's complete?
We are planning to complete by the second week of November.
Wow. So very, very soon. Yeah.
It's actually coming up, really. One thing I would refer back to in your most recent comment, you mentioned it's not that ketogenic metabolic therapy. That is exactly true. So I think this field needs to be driven by scientific evidence. There might be that the ketogenic angle was the one that helped to facilitate the development of this metabolic psychiatry. But by no means that is the only way. There are going to be many other ways to change brain and systemic energy metabolism in the body. Some might be pharmacological, might be drugs like GLP-1 agonists, really interesting, completely new field. Could be fasting, could be ketogenic metabolic therapy, could be supplementation with ketones, or there could be many, many, many other things, which now we don't even think about. Thinking about how to improve the function of mitochondria. Are there pharmacological agents that could specifically achieve that and have metabolic and therefore mental health benefits? So there are lots of questions. And yes, ketogenic metabolic therapy is likely to be one, but very likely to be not the only one.
And when you start looking at these ideas, it seems to me like there is that common thread, whether it's a fecal transplant, which talks about a microbiome, whether it's fasting, whether it's, low refined sugars, or a ketogenic type where it's actual being in ketosis or a lifestyle. All these things are somewhat funneling into how important the fuel source is, where we started at the beginning of this conversation. There's a fuel source that goes in that is feeding a microbiome, that is feeding the brain. It's being used to convert, into the energy that we have some understanding of what the brain might like, or what the brain might not like, or the body might not like. We do know of a brain-mind, connection, and we know this when someone is physically hurt, they also have psychological difficulties too. So it's not just the brain, it's not just a loss of identity that, for example, with a leg injury or a hip transplant or whatever it is, hip surgery. There's lots of things that are in play, and I like this approach of let's try and understand what the contributing factors are and how they're converging. But there's a lot of really promising potential clues that are underway, and I hope we learn a lot more through your study and the others as well. It seems like it's just such early days.
Yes.
These
are early but very exciting days. Yeah.
But moving fast as well. It feels like when the evidence is solid and it gets more and more eventually funding, I can't imagine what it's going to look like in 5 to 10 years when the RCTs are funded and run, and then it becomes harder and harder to dispute, and therefore ask even more important questions that can continue on. So
I think rigorous science is essential.
Yes.
Without that and the evidence gathered by conducting rigorous science, this field and any other field couldn't go anywhere.
Where can people continue this conversation? There's many listeners that might be excited by this. They might be thinking about themselves. They might want to explore this further. Where can we point them? Where does this conversation lead to? Any websites, any books, articles? Where would you recommend a good starting point?
So I have a few, not that many, few recorded talks on YouTube. Some are scientific conference talks, others are podcasts like this. I do have a web page at my university's, within my university's web page, which doesn't contain a whole lot of information, but I can be found on the internet. I have a LinkedIn profile, which is my professional profile. And time and time again, actually quite frequently, I'm getting emails and being approached by people with interest in this area, either due to personal reasons or someone in the family And I endeavor answering as many of those as I can. I think as scientists, our responsibility is to the people who fund our research and support our research.
Thank you for those, and very wisely. And I ask you, I plead with you, please continue to do these types of podcasts. One of the things that I found in my podcast over these years is academics are phenomenal in phenomenal human beings as people, as contributors. The great challenge is always about how do we distribute, and distribution is I think the key of moving the needle, because there's a lot of scientific evidence that is available, but it's not moving the needle because it just doesn't have distribution. So I thank you so much for coming onto this show, and we've got a distribution, but I urge you continue to speak. I will also continue to speak with this, not because this is the cure, the solution, but rather this is hopefully a rigorous and language-bound conversation about saying what do we currently know without huge claims. And that's refreshing, that there's a conversation that can be had, but it's vital because this is how science actually works. It limits itself and says this is what we do know because there's another hypothesis that needs to be tested. So thank you for your work, your time today. I know how busy you are. I wish you all the very best, and I'd love to have you back on at some point to either discuss your current works, really appreciate your contributions to what I believe is humanity. When we talk about humans being supported with information and knowledge to better their well-being, whether it's on that physical side, where it's on the neurological side, the psychological side, something like this talks about the whole lot as a fuel source. So please keep speaking up, and thank you again for all your contributions and today.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation.